Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to be looking at this guy today, an old Wraith from the 90s for 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battles. This was sculpted by Gary Morley back in the day and is an example of his earlier style of sculpting. It's definitely very, very wavy in terms of the fabric, and it's got some really interesting details which I really like a lot, like all these weird little skulls on the side of his cowl and so on. So he's a really fun model. Wraiths are a fascinating unit, the like of which hasn't been seen for a while, and I hope you enjoy watching me paint this guy as we embark on this journey together. Okay, guys, without further ado, let's get started. So let's jump right in. Okay, we're going to begin with a base coat of this is Luxion purple mixed with Magos purple to create a more balanced purple tone. Something that's a little bit too like not too much in either the warm burgundy sort of spectrum or the bluish indigo kind of spectrum, but somewhere in between because I think when it comes to undead, you want a very specific shade of purple, something that kind of straddles that line between that red spectrum and that blue spectrum. So this, in my opinion, is the perfect way to paint undead cloth, and it's something that I used previously for Nagash as well. So we're just going to place this lightly over his entire robe, and we're going to reserve, like, we're going to make sure that we cover everything evenly and lightly, and that basically gives us a bit of room to come back in to basically do some shading as well using the same color, but that can come a little bit later on. What I find is with unexpectedly, for me anyway, is that the purple contrast paints tend to come out a little bit blotchy. I'm not sure why this is exactly, but yeah, it kind of comes out a little bit more blotchy than I would intend, and it takes multiple coats to really sort of get good. So I guess this is a study in patience. We're going to keep the inside of that fold over here a different color just because it's an opportunity for us to add a little bit more interest to his outfit, which is really cool. I think I like this model's very sort of it's funky. It's kind of cool looking and interesting, but it's also not too over the top, which is just what you want for an undead beastie. Yeah. So beasties, right? I'm like undead wraiths are just they're so funky a unit that I just don't quite know how to put them into the unit to make them work. And I think a lot of players of 4th edition Warhammer back in the day were also kind of confused by how this unit was supposed to function. Because, as I'm about to demonstrate, these units either swept the table clear before them because nothing could hurt them, or else they were absolutely useless. And this dichotomy, like, kind of really depends on which army you're fighting against, because the one weakness that these guys have is magical weapons, right? And bearing in mind that this is the era of Herohammer, if you've bought a whole bunch of magic items, if you've gone to the extent of giving every unit champion a magic weapon of some description, Wraiths have no chance. On the flip side, however, if you've basically bought no magic items for all your characters, if you've tried to essentially have more units on the table because you were saving points on magic items, first of all, why are you playing 4th edition at all? Because this is the era of Hero Hammer, and magic weapons were disproportionately powerful for what they cost. But also, the Wraiths would have a field day because nothing could hurt them. And so this wild sort of swinginess in terms of effectiveness really made Wraiths quite an enigma on the tabletop. And frankly, you would get in tournaments people who would go down both ways. Either they would spend a huge amount of points on Wraiths, and trust me, it is easy to spend a huge amount of points on Wraiths because they're so expensive, right? Like even a handful of them would rack up the points like crazy. Each one of these guys was 75 points, and if you've watched the Screaming Skull Catapult video that we did before, you'd know that's actually more than a Screaming Skull Catapult, which is insane. The idea of a single miniature in a regiment, a single troop model in a regiment, costing more than an artillery piece is odd, shall we say. So anyway, so these guys, they were troops. Yeah, so they would take up your troop allocation. You could use them as just regiments in place of more mundane undead like skeletons and zombies and such. But they were completely immune to magical weapons. So, in addition, they had a rather unusual stat line. Their strength, toughness, movement, and so on were all pretty unremarkable. What they did have for them, however, was an unusual number of wounds and a slightly higher than average toughness. So each of these guys had 3 wounds, 2 attacks, and a toughness of 4. So they were decent. They were not remarkable. To put it in context, a Chaos Warrior for this era had weapon skill 6. Granted 1 wound, but weapon skill 6, and just really high stats for what you would expect for basic troop units of this era, right? So, but yeah, the Wraiths were kind of odd. So the main problem obviously is that it's really hard to balance a unit that has immunity to non-magic weapons, right? Because in certain situations they're just unstoppable, and in other situations they're utterly useless. But you could count on in most tournaments facing a lot more mundane stuff than you would necessarily find huge amounts of costly units like unit champions and so on. Simply because a larger army gave you a little bit more tactical flexibility. You have more units that you could kind of throw away to buy you time, or else they could be seizing table quarters or all that sort of good stuff. The Herohammer units you could play in a points denial sort of a way. In other words, you would let them chew through your cheaper units, and so for this reason, undead armies generally consisted of, well, those who are trying to exploit the race to their fullest potential. I mean, generally consisted of 3 different units. They had stone throwers, basically your skull chakra catapults. I mean, you had wraiths, and then you had essentially really cheap units of either flyers like carrion because they were really useful, or else you would have handfuls of disposable 5-man units of zombies or similar that you wouldn't mind being crushed by your opponent's best units. And you would sort of corral your opponent into a situation where you could do maximum damage without suffering losses. It's just a really weird way to play. And in my opinion, the reason why this was is because 4th edition Warhammer Undead felt more like almost like a D&D kind of source book, where essentially you had to give points to every single kind of undead beastie, and wraiths just happened to be on the very costly end of this spectrum. They were essentially the units, the undead troop type that you would least want to encounter as a bunch of adventuring heroes. But on the battlefield, where you have every kind of conceivable threat imaginable, wraiths sometimes would just fall afoul of like a proliferation of magic weapons and magic missiles and so on and so forth, and it would be possible to basically just lose an entire army comprised of wraiths this way if you just happen to pick the wrong opponent. So yeah, just a really quirky unit, and just I don't know. I think they were iconic for me because as a child, as a young Warhammer enthusiast, I looked at these and I was like, I have no idea how to make these work. But the idea of painting up a bunch of these admittedly really cool miniatures, because I mean they look like death, when they're young and edgy, you're like, oh, these are like the coolest things possible. And you only needing like a handful of these guys, as opposed to whole regiments of skeletons and similar, really felt quite compelling to me. And then of course I will fight Skaven and I'll get absolutely mullered by Giselles and all that sort of thing. And it just didn't go well. But it's all in a day's work for the Saturday morning like cartoon villains like look of the undead at the point anyway. So really a fascinating unit, and under the right circumstances, utterly deadly. They would crush everything before them. If you were fighting the wrong opponent, then it would be game over, like almost instantly. Yeah. So there you go. Cool. Anyway, back to the painting. So with the Luxion purple plus Magos purple mix, like I said, it went on fairly patchily in the beginning, but as always, we trust the process. Bit by bit, we apply more of this purple where it's needed to sort of up the saturation and shading where it's required, and just kind of take the time and enjoy the process of applying this. Yeah, and it gradually should look better over time because the patchiness should give way to the most beautiful saturated color that we can generate easily using contrast paints. So it's just a case of taking the time, applying this slowly, and then we'll come back in. We'll swoop right back in with highlights at the right point, and I trust that you will find this pretty appealing. So, yeah, Wraiths. Such an enigma. Oh, right. So there are a ton of special rules as well. In addition to what I mentioned earlier about them being immune to non-magical weapons, and well, only immune to magical weapons is the way to look at it. Magical weapons and spells and so on. There was the idea that these guys were able to drain levels in D&D. So on the Warhammer tabletop, what you would have is that they had an ability to drain energy to set the will to fight of units that they damaged in close combat, which is just another strong Wraith trope, in my opinion. So what would happen is that in combat with any unit with multiple wounds, should they inflict a wound on them, the unit would subsequently lose for the rest of the battle. The remainder of the battle, they would suffer -1 to hit against all targets. So that just represented the idea that the Wraiths were slowly draining the will to fight of enemy units, or else slowing their limbs down with like frigid cold and evil nature, which kind of made a lot of sense because in terms of lore, these guys were failed. Well, they were wizards who basically succumbed to the crippling effects of practicing dark magic. If you were a wizard and you were going into practicing necromancy and dark magic, generally speaking, you would find ways to insulate your soul from the debilitating effects of the magic that you were casting, so that you would not suffer too many of the ill effects that eventually drained the life of well, undead in general. So usually what this meant is that necromancers would keep in their vicinity either protective, ablative spirits and souls that they could trade trade in exchange for their own to power their spells and so on. And if they failed to do this, then eventually your own soul, the magic user's soul, will be drained away, and you will be turned into a wraith after many years of prolonged exposure to dark magic. Kind of like magical radiation in a way, would basically turn you into an empty husk of a creature, and that's not good for your plans of world domination. So yeah, that's what happens. You get turned into a lifeless wraith, a husk of your former life, and then after that, you basically get formed into bizarre units for Warhammer, and then you run around like wreaking havoc on any target that didn't have magic weapons. In addition, because Wraiths were these horrid, sort of empty, hollow creatures, they cause terror, which is no joke really, because any unit that failed its terror test basically would be sent packing. They would flee immediately. And that would mean that if you did this early in the start of the game, granted these guys were not the fastest, so you couldn't really get too close to enemy units too early on. But what it would mean is that you could send, for example, flying units packing if they attempted to charge you and they failed the leadership test. So terror's good, right? They also cause auto breaking if they outnumbered their opponents, although with Wraiths this is extremely difficult because any unit that causes terror automatically causes fear as well, and fear would cause units outnumbered by a victorious unit of fear causing creatures to break automatically without recourse to a break test. Mouthful, really, but what that would mean is that when they beat their opponents, they would usually send them packing so long as they were outnumbered by the Wraiths. Right. So, like I said, rarely comes into play because Wraiths were so expensive that they tended not to outnumber their opponents. But yeah, there you go. What else? There were other quirky little bits. Let's see. Right. They are immune to psychology, of course, as with all other undead. It's just how they were. Yes, the important one. They could not flee. So, if a unit of Wraith gets beaten in combat, either because your opponent has invested wisely in unit champions or characters with magic items and could therefore hurt them, or if rank bonus and just positioning like being charged in the flank, for example, and all these other cumulative effects basically led to the Wraiths maybe losing combat, then yeah, basically these guys would just crumble to dust if they failed their break test. So that make them even swingier, right? Because you've got this unit that costs a bomb, and then if they would happen to maybe screw up their attacks or get run up into something that's a little bit too tough for them to handle, frankly, then they would just crumble on their leadership of 5, which is tragic. I mean, granted, most undead characters like necromancers or vampires had a leadership of 10. And you only needed to really be within 12 inches to sort of let the race use your leadership. So that's rarely a problem. But should a unit of raids be caught, on their own and, without recourse to the higher leadership of a character, they will just instantly vanish on their leadership of 5. And that's just for units that cost so many points. Okay, I think we're in a good place with the purple for now. We're gonna hit this with a hairdryer, and then we'll come back to continue this process. Okay, so we're returning to the purple, this time with a bit of Vallejo Silver Grey mix into our contrast mix. Yes, you can mix light colors like Vallejo Silver Grey or white directly into the contrast paint, so you don't need to fumble around trying to find a color that matches the contrast color entirely. You can use the contrast paint itself, and that actually helps to create a smoother blend that doesn't depart in hue from the original. And as with most Gary Morley miniatures, of which this is certainly a very recognizable one, an example of his earlier work, to be honest, I find that you can really find these large folds, like the tops of these folds are so prominent and so pronounced that it's really just a case of, like what I'm doing now, drawing on the highlights onto these points, and you should have quite a decent looking highlight going down. You just need to, I guess, be patient with it, not rush the highlight, and build it up slowly and carefully over time, and you should have something that looks quite appealing so long as you are patient and build up the color slowly. Take your time with it, really enjoy the process, and just focus on these really large folds. As you can see, there's not a lot to it. The folds are so prominent that it's really just about applying them in the right place. And you can go a little bit more subtle at first, but I like to go in with bold highlights because I would rather come back in and trim this down later, cut back into it with the original contrast color, than basically having an under highlighted miniature, because I find that kind of gives me the best effect that I can achieve within this amount of time painting models on camera. As always, your own mileage will vary, so take your time to find the painting style that you most enjoy. Right, so a little bit more. Yeah, so a bit more purple and silver gray. We're now going on into the second stage highlight, and this really is about focusing on the edges, like so, to draw the eye to the tops of these folds. So even though a lot of these folds are very aggressively curled at the bottom, what I found is that it tends to look better if we concentrate the highlight on the top edge of these, because we're trying to focus the eye onto the origin of these folds as opposed to where they naturally terminate at the bottom of the folds. That tends to make more sense visually because you're drawing the eye upwards towards other more interesting details rather than focusing the mind at the bottom of the cloth. So as always, for these large horizontal folds, you want to concentrate the highlights at the bottom. Kind of imagine like the lower lip of a cup. The top really doesn't need the highlight all that much, but the lower half kind of is very much where the light would gather, assuming a zenithal source of light, of course. So up here, yep, right here at the top of these folds. And again, where it comes to here, you want to create that lip, that lower lip, like again, like I mentioned, the inside lower rim of a cup. You can balance that with it's almost like the light pools in the lower part of those surfaces. Kind of, yeah, like the mouth of a cup. I guess you can just picture that as you paint, and it will help you get the highlights to where they need to go. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can see that I'm applying the highlights quite roughly because I intend to come back in with purple again to sort of help these blend in beautifully. Um, the reason for this is quite clear because I enjoy having like really strong highlights, and the sacrifice I guess you make for having like really strong full strength color saturated highlights is that sometimes the edges need a little bit more work to blend them in better into the original colors below it. Then it's a case of taking the original contrast paint and coming in to trim away at some of these highlights. And I think I do find it a lot easier to trim them using highlights than to try to paint perfectly sharp highlights. Come back and trim it using contrast, I'm sorry. Yeah. That's what I meant. Yeah. So emphasize the point of this little hoodie. And yeah, I think the highlights are coming together quite nicely now. It's just about making sure that the saturation is correct for the areas that we want to draw the eye to. And as it turns out, that tends to be towards the top, the origin of these folds, and less so on where they end up going, which is towards the floor. Something like that. Yeah. So our wraith is starting to look a little bit pretty. As promised, we're going to come in now with a little bit of purple, the original contrast color, and we're going to blend in some of the areas where I clearly went a little bit overboard. So you can go ahead and apply this right at the edges to trim the excess of these highlights, and you can see they blend in quite nicely with the original. Make sure that all of these areas are not too much. Also, like here for example, where there is a bit of a tide mark, this wasn't intended, but it clearly needed another coat of purple to kind of trim it down, cut it back like so. And you can sort of apply it like this at the lower end of the color strip, and you'll find that it helps it blend back into the original purple just right, because it is in fact the same color, right? So of course it blends correctly, like so. Yeah, there we go. So thus begins the painter's dance, which is what I use to describe the idea that you can go back and forth with highlights and sort of shading using the original contrast paint to kind of clean up areas where we've overdone things a little bit, and it's inevitable because you do want to try to finish these models like fairly quickly. Yes, they're super expensive 75-point miniatures, but we also don't necessarily need to spend hours and hours on every miniature, simply because, well, they are characters that are there to soak up our time, and frankly, you're going to need to be painting a fair number of undead models, no matter what kind of unit you're going to pick, because, well, the undead look good at hordes, don't they? So yeah, there we go. So I think our purple robe is in a good place. Maybe just a little bit more trimming and glazing over with our purple contrast mix. Again, just in case you missed it earlier, that's a mix of Luxion purple and Magos purple, which gives us this really pretty, um, rich looking, kind of in between blue and burgundy sort of purple. And I think that's looking pretty good. So we're going to take a break from the purple now, and we're going to jump into doing some of his other details, like his face and the inside of his robe. I think for the inside of the robe, I'm going to go with Aeldari Emerald, but because we've got this gigantic scythe to work on as well, maybe let's do the scythe first. And the reason why will be clear very soon. This is essentially Mantis Warriors Green, and I really like these magical colors. Yes, there is a whole debate about whether wraiths themselves are magical, whether their attacks are magical. The rules are kind of silent on that, so it begs the really bizarre question of, can wraiths kill each other? And the answer is nobody knows. So in the rules, it doesn't overtly state that wraiths weapons and attacks count as magical. So in theory, at least, they can't really hurt each other. I think there was at least one Warhammer Grand Tournament of the time where an undead army comprised with a majority of wraiths fought another army comprised of a large number of wraiths, and both wraith units kind of got into combat with each other and essentially had the same combat result every single turn. And if you're wondering who won that confrontation between undead armies from 4th edition Warhammer, the answer was the army that basically bought less wraiths because they had fewer points tied up in that ridiculous combat, and eventually, well, nothing really happened. But that's a kind of cool Warhammer story that you get from armies of that era, because they were particularly weird and wonderful and kind of great to read about. So I find that the green works really well with purple, and Mantis Warriors Green in particular has this fantastic kind of nuclear green color, which I really enjoy. And we're going to lean a little bit further into this because Mantis Warriors Green has this yellowish hue to it. We're going to lean in with Aeldari Emerald to produce a sort of bluish shade, which I think is particularly effective at bringing out that spectrum of this green. I like very much the idea of using. So, say for example, we got color like green, right? And green is basically blue and yellow. Oops. Green is essentially blue and yellow mixed, right? So, what I like is to have a more yellow green on the lighter parts of the blend, and then I like to use a bluish green essentially for the darker parts of it, and that sort of color change uh, is extremely pleasing to me for some reason. I think visually it makes it way more interesting than if we had just stuck with the same shade, the same hue of green, and just highlighted that with a lighter color, like say yellow or white, as the case may be. So let me just prove this to you, hopefully, as we sort of put in a little bit more shading on the base of this scythe. Yeah, cool. Now, for the inside of his robe, as mentioned, we're going to be jumping into some Aeldari Emerald, and this is really just going to give our miniature a little bit of time to dry, or our scythe blade a little bit of time to dry as we sort of come in and we kind of fill this area with this glorious shade of Aeldari Emerald, which is this beautiful kind of teal, this emerald teal color. It's really quite pretty. So, bearing in mind that there is an exposed sexy leg over here, the skeleton leg, we want to make sure that we don't get any Aeldari Emerald on that, because wouldn't that be a nightmare? So Aeldari Emerald goes onto there. Not to worry if it comes off a little bit patchy at first. In hindsight, I think maybe some of the patchiness may have to do with the finish of the model in its entirety, because this is just one of those really, I mean, older miniatures sometimes suffer from a phenomenon called lead rot, which is where the model might have been improperly stored and in conditions that basically didn't have enough oxygen, and that could cause a reaction with the lead of the miniature, and basically gave it a bit of a pitted effect, which is what the contrast paint maybe flowing into. But it's okay. We'll make this work all the same, and maybe a little bit of grain and texture on that part of the miniature isn't the worst thing in the world. In fact, I think I kind of like the look of that. It gives the impression of having a slightly different fabric, essentially. And fabric, you can simulate a lot of interest on fabric by making it slightly grainy, so long as you keep the shading in the right place. Graininess need not look poorly painted, so long as you make sure that the dark and light spots are still intended to calculate are placed exactly, with intent to draw the eye, as mentioned. So in the case of this blade, a bit more Mantis Warriors green to create the fade that we want, like so. And then we're going to take a bit of Mantis Warriors green. You'll work on producing that blend. So as you can see, where it is coming towards the leg, maybe what we can do is we can leave that lighter so that it draws the eye suitably, like so. And then it gets a bit darker over onto the left side. I think that looks just fine. And then we wait for the scythe to dry fully. Let's put a little bit of Skeleton Horde plus Gryphcharger Gryphcharger Grey onto the bone areas, which is what I like to call ancient bone. It's just one of those go-to colors that I use when I want to create a bit of bone, like painting bone, but with a little less saturation, so that it looks a little bit older and kind of ancient and worn. So the amount of Gryphcharger Grey that you can put into your Skeleton Horde is really optional. But I think the color that I have now, which is majority Skeleton Horde, it's something like in the order of like 3 parts of Skeleton Horde to 1 part of Gryphcharger Grey, creates something that visibly still looks like bone, but maybe is lacking a bit of warmth, which is what we want, because wraiths are supposed to be frozen, or rather they're supposed to have chill attacks, right? So they're supposed to drain the warmth from living beings, which is their trope. So using a slightly less warm tone of bone tone, is kind of ideal, I think, for capturing their specific brand of evil. I'm also going to fill in like the area around his face, because that's going to be dark. So doing it in our bone tone is just fine as is, and then we'll kind of double down on that when we paint the trim, by layering on additional color to darken that sort of shaded hollow inside his hood. So a bit more on the foot, the other foot, and that goes right into this recess. And then now we're going to paint it onto his leg over here. And again, just like we did with the hood, we're going to fill up this little space. Yeah, do want it to be green though. That would be nice. So maybe we won't fill in that recess. Oopsie. And the moment I said I wanted it to be green, it basically decided to be green. Wonderful. Sometimes this happens. Don't let it. Well, I mean, if it gets really bad, with the bleed of colors because you didn't let your contrast paint dry, what you can do is you can take a wet brush and sort of wick off the colors that you don't want, or else just let the whole thing dry, hit it with a hairdryer or something. Make sure that it doesn't get too distracting to look at, but most importantly, don't get flustered. Let it just sort of happen, and we'll fix that a little bit later on. Oh yes, he's got another skull over here, which is kind of looks like the one from Scream. It's kind of adorable. Lower jaw, other side. And top of the head. Cool. I think that's looking pretty decent. A little bit more for the eyes. I do love how slightly wonky the eyes are for this guy. Guess the dark magic's been pooling in unexpected areas for a long time, giving him a little bit of a bleh kind of face. Kind of adorable, really. At least unless you were facing them en masse on the tabletop without magic items to combat them, in which case, oops, not good. Right, so as promised, we are dipping back into the Aeldari Emerald, and we're going to add that previously promised blend. So as you can see, the Aeldari Emerald really works beautifully with this sort of apple green Mantis Warriors green. And because, there is a hue shift, you don't even need to work that hard to create an interesting finished effect. Visually, it's going to be really appealing either way. And this is a I like to call this the power weapon color. So every army 40k of fantasy, I like to pick up a range of tones, to address just certain dangerous parts of the army. So for power weapons, magical weapons, and the like, I like to pick out a way of treating them that I keep relatively consistent across all examples of this in the army. So, for example, wherever I have what is ostensibly a powerful undead model, I like to do all their weapons in the same style of so-called power weapon, so that it kind of draws the eye to which units are more dangerous. In contrast, for the basic skeletons and zombies and such, I don't have this ridiculously gaudy kind of magical effect. I instead just use a much more mundane looking silver with non-oil, or a little bit of a brown wash, because I'm not trying to draw attention to the more mundane and less powerful undead units, but save that effect for the more impressive and scary undead units like the Wraiths. We go back to Aeldari Emerald now to deal with this little section. There is a risk, I suppose, that we might get it a little bit on the leg, but no worry. Even if we do make mistakes, we deal with them in our own way. We'll come back in and we'll do some touching up with highlights when it comes time to highlight that glorious leg anyway. So I think that looks alright, not too bad. Yeah. Cool. So, okay, so we move on to putting on some snakebite leather now for his weapon. So when you've got a model that's basically covered in all sorts of insane colors, I think sometimes it's good to give the eye a little bit of a reprieve by using something that looks a little bit more normal, I suppose, a little bit more mundane, simply because the eye does need relief from all the crazy garish colors every now and then, just to make sure that it doesn't get too maxed out. So when I put on browns for things like wood and so on, it's actually rather rare that I use something like snakebite leather, which is a little bit more of a mid-tone brown. And the reason for this is that I don't really want too much of a model to be essentially what is a muddy kind of desaturated brown. But every now and then, I find uses for this simply because, it's a good background color, I suppose, for something that I don't really want to emphasize too much. Now, this scythe pole, I guess, goes all the way around his person, so it is going to have quite a strong look if I were to say do it in a bright red, for example, even though that's the style of the era. I noticed that for the original models, original color scheme, they didn't really do it that way as well, because I think for the same reasons, it would be a little bit too garish. So this is one of the few times when I would actually choose a color that's a little bit less saturated and a little bit more chill, just so that the other colors can pop that much more. You'd be amazed how easy it would be for, say, a bright red staff across colors like purple and bone to just pop and dominate the color scheme entirely. So I think these keeps things more or less in their perspective, each to play its part in that sense. So just getting this in to all the recesses and all the little crevices. And I'm pretty happy with the way that looks. I think I will come back in and add a few more little bits and bobs later. But essentially, I'm happy with this color so far. Next, I will move on to put on a little bit of Iyanden yellow onto his hood trim. So now I sort of debated long and hard internally with myself about what color to use for this area, simply because it's a fairly important part of his outfit, but at the same time it couldn't be too bold of a color. Yellow, surprisingly, because it occurs in other parts of the miniature already. It's present, I suppose, visually in small amounts in the bone areas. That warmth is elsewhere already, so it doesn't look too bad, especially when I tone this down later on. The other thing is that it's actually covered in little skulls, which are really amusing and cute. So I might pick these out in a different color, not just leave them like this. I will debate it internally later on. Next, we move on to apply silver onto all of these decorations and bits, with the eye to doing them in gold later on. That's why I felt that yellow wouldn't be too disruptive for the color scheme. Yellow is already going to be occurring on the miniature in many ways, in part on the gold as well as tiny amounts in the bone and so on. So there is already precedent for that level of warmth in the miniature. So in my opinion, yellow wouldn't look too out of place on this model. I guess we will find out together. So just popping this on the sort of end cap of his Grim Reaper scythe. It's actually got little toothy kind of edges onto it, kind of like a sawtooth pattern on the edge. Quite like the look of that. There's a little detail that I guess I didn't appreciate when I was younger and looking at this model. Didn't realize it had these little like quirky little touches. So quite nice. This silver then goes on also to his decorative chain that drapes around his waist and sort of like falls over his fabric of his robe. This is sculpted in the traditional 90s kind of style, nice and chunky. And the links of the chain are always at 90 degrees to the viewer, so I think this is probably for mode release reasons, but I happen to think that it looks pretty good this way. Very readable as a result. There's a little bit around his waist in the front as well, and I need to make sure that I do this without putting too much paint onto the purple, although to be fair, a small amount isn't going to kill anyone. Unlike this Wraith, whose job most certainly is butchering poor Imperial soldiers. It's a tough life being in the Empire. Okay, so next I am going to put a little bit more detail into the Wraith scythe. So I've got a little bit of Vallejo Ice Yellow mixing in a little bit of Mantis Warriors Green and essentially adding a bit of a highlight. You can see how light this is as it goes on. Really the point here is to emphasize the hard edge of the weapon by focusing on the edges to give it a nice edge highlight. You can see that I've actually done the entire top of it, and then a little bit more here at the bottom, and this is because this isn't the brightest highlight that I will be going to, so it's entirely okay to cover this. And because the color is still fairly close to the original Mantis Warriors Green over Pylox Grey White Undercoat, it doesn't look too jarring yet, but it will shortly get a little bit more exciting as I let more of the ice yellow shine through. So you can go ahead and be fairly heavy-handed with this, and maybe put a little bit more emphasis on that little notch. Not sure why his scythe has a little notch over here, but it kind of looks cool. I like the look of it. It looks dangerous and hooky. It doesn't really occur on good guy weapons of the time, so that gives it a little bit more extra flavor and bad guy cred. Now, just making sure that this area has a highlight that tapers correctly, and I think we are in a good place. A little bit more emphasis to the tip. I will be adding more ice yellow at the tip side. Tip side? Is that a phrase? I don't know. Yeah, but putting a little bit more emphasis towards the tip of the blade, because I see that as the apex kind of area that happens to be conveniently above the Wraith's head as well. So that's a good place to sort of draw the eye towards. There we go. And then now we go practically pure ice yellow, if not pure ice yellow, because we want to make sure that the tip of this really jumps out at you. So if you don't have ice yellow from Vallejo, you can also use, I believe, several paint manufacturers now produce ice yellow. And ice yellow is just really one of those colors that's extremely useful for highlighting warm tone colors, whether they're greens or even reds, because ice yellow really allows you to push the brightness and the lightness of the hue without losing saturation too much. If you add white to green as well as to red, oftentimes you will get a fairly chalky highlight, and that's kind of not ideal. So you might wonder what the point of adding a very pale yellow is, and it's for that reason exactly, so that the highlight basically doesn't look too washed out and indistinct. You kind of get to keep hold of your saturation levels with ice yellow. So thoroughly recommend that you pick up this color if you want to be able to push your greens and your reds to the most extreme highlights possible without losing saturation. So pretty happy with the way that looks. Now I'm going back to Snakebite Leather just to add a little bit more shading around where his hand meets the wooden surface. This can be feathered out gently so that it blends nicely into the surface and allows me to basically work a bit more additional color and saturation into these parts to better define them separately when viewed. Yeah, so it's quite a complicated structure, I suppose. Some of these areas do look a little bit odd and therefore require just a little bit more visual separation just so that the viewer can more easily visually tell them apart. Sometimes a miniature that's complicated looking really benefits from having a little bit of care put into visually separating the different parts through use of color, and this is just one of those perfect examples. The model will look a lot more readable and clear as a result of this step. Cool. So last thing I want to do for now, well, last in the sense that before I pause and have a think about what next to use in terms of color, is to drop on a little bit of gold shading onto those parts of the accessories that I want to bring out a little bit more. So it behooves us to not overuse gold simply because there is a lot of it potentially if we do that. Yeah, so just a little bit of this on where I guess it adds the most visual punch, and I think that puts us in a good place to consider the next steps for the miniature. So I have to say that when I paint models like these, right, I honestly don't have anything more than a loose idea of what colors I want to use. I roughly knew I wanted to make this guy sort of purple, both because I think he looks good in purple, but also because I think purple is a color that's a little bit underexplored in terms of factions available at the time. Because I've been painting models from all across the range for 4th edition Warhammer and kind of really jumping from place to place, I kind of settled on a color being important to each of the factions. And for Undead, the color that I've picked is purple simply because you just look so darn good in it. And frankly, not every faction can pull this off. Okay. Something bizarre just happened, I suppose. It's because a little bit of the gold ran onto the silver. So I'm dropping a bit of Nuln Oil in to the silver to sort of define it a little bit more. Nuln Oil, as mentioned before, is modern Nuln Oil, that is. What's available in Games Workshop stores these days is a little bit weaker. You could push up the saturation or basically the amount of black in Nuln Oil by simply adding a small amount of Black Legion. That's what I've chosen to do. But well, I mean, that's what I would choose to do for future bottles. I haven't actually run out of old Nuln Oil yet because I stockpiled this stuff when it basically got replaced. And yeah, love this stuff. So to emulate this sort of look, you can simply add a bit of Black Legion, which is my darkening color of choice because it's a nice warm black as opposed to Black Templar, which has a different use entirely. And I think that looks pretty good. Now, we are going to move on to add a bit of Vallejo Silver Grey. You know what? I think we might jump straight to white now that I think about it. Let's jump straight to white for picking out the skulls on his hoodie. So, the reason why we jump straight to white is because actually we are basically going to have bone colored skulls on a yellow hood trim. So there is a need to make sure that these are a little bit further apart in terms of hue, and just to make sure that they don't look too similar. And yet we don't want something to be a little bit too gaudy with patterning. So I guess we do want it to be a little bit closer together. I don't know. It's sometimes it's possible to think yourself in circles when picking color schemes for miniatures. I think sometimes the best thing you can do is to just try it out on the surface and see if it works for you. See if you like the look of what you're putting out on paper or on the miniature surface rather, and just decide whether you want to proceed with it or not. In this case, I think there is a decent amount of separation between these two colors, but I'm going to have to see what happens when the wash goes down over the surface. Either way, these are stylized skulls, they're not actual skulls, so nothing's really committing me to making them exactly the same shade as I guess a bone would be painted on a miniature of the time. So let's see how that goes. While we're at it, since we've got the white out, we can go ahead and drop a bit of a simple highlight onto most of the skull bits. Nothing too complex here, just a simple white highlight, and it's going to be fairly stark, so we want to be a bit careful how we place these. Make sure we taper things accordingly, and ensure that we try to leave as like a decent amount of unhighlighted surface area as well. Try to space out the highlights, or not space it out, but really kind of I guess allow for enough of the unhighlighted surface to show, just so that we make sure that we don't cover up all of the good work that we've done up until this point. Pardon me if that was off camera. Got to adjust it slightly sometimes. It's a bit hard to see from a funny angle. But yeah, I love painting bony hands. I kind of feel like the extra little bits of shading around the knuckles can be extra impactful. And over the course of my Warhammer career, my Warhammer painting career, so to speak, I have painted a shocking number of undead miniatures, and they've always been fun to paint. There's something very entertaining about painting undead. I don't know what it is. I guess it's that sort of Saturday morning cartoon villain sort of look. I think undead get a bit less compelling for me when they're a little bit too edgy and too serious. I like these slightly cartoonish skeletons. They just look like they're having such a good time, probably because they're all grimacing and showing off all their pearly whites. There must be some dental plan that you have in the undead side of things in Warhammer, because all of these undead have beautiful teeth. And they're so much fun to paint, to pick up bit by bit. And frankly, because they're a high contrast kind of look, I find that the finished models look really eye-catching and interesting. A little bit on his knee, being sure that we cover up those bits where we got a little bit of the green on it earlier. So this is what I mean by sometimes our later highlights actually come back in and fix some of our shading wash mistakes. And frankly, if we just take a long hard look at what we've achieved up until this point, we can decide whether a little bit of extra touching up is required. If not, then we can move on and just be happy about it, as opposed to, I guess, kind of painting by numbers, painting by rote, and applying a highlight simply because we plan to add a highlight. That's kind of not ideal in my opinion. A little bit more of a loose and expressive kind of approach, wherein we are leaving ourselves room to change things as we move along, or to add extra highlights if the model requires it, is how I prefer to paint these days. So yeah, I do notice that he's got a bit of a golden bangle going on, and golden because, well, I think it happened to look really good in gold. So let's do that. A bit of silver to block in the bangle first, and then we'll come back in with our standard gold mix, which I failed to mention earlier. So I like to do my golds by painting them silver first, and then after that applying a layer of Nazdreg yellow mixed with Seraphim Sepia. Seraphim Sepia. I think it's Seraphim. Honestly, sometimes the Games Workshop names kind of get away from me. But yeah, this is a bit more Iyanden yellow as I wait for that section of silver to dry. A little bit more Iyanden yellow to shade down his hoodie cowl, which I have to say looks kind of Christmassy. And then we can go back to adding that gold wash, Nazdreg yellow plus Seraphim Sepia onto that bangle to complete that look. Likewise, a little bit more of a touch up around the edges of this area here, and then a little bit more non-oil to catch that section where we spilled a little bit of silver onto his purple robe. The other nice thing about working with contrasts primarily is that you can gradually take your time to build up touch-ups over the surface and not have to, I guess, immediately commit to fixing something 100% if you're not entirely sure about where you're headed. It promotes a kind of like meditative kind of see how things go kind of approach to painting, which I particularly enjoy because I think now that I rarely like paint models for armies as much, this approach allows me to be a little bit more thoughtful about the way I apply paint onto miniatures, and that's been very freeing for me personally on an artistic standpoint. Been free to enjoy the way I paint, free to enjoy what I paint, simply because I'm not entirely fussed about whether miniatures are going to be seeing some kind of a massed battle game at some point or not. On the flip side, however, having said that, this guy is almost certainly going to make his way into Warhammer Quest, simply because the party has, I guess, reached and in some cases exceeded the levels where we have things like Wraiths prowling the table regularly. So this guy is going to be an extra special enemy character that we are going to be encountering in the depths of the Warhammer world, as we are wont to say. Cool. Now we can move on to applying a little bit more green to blend together the highlights that we added earlier to make sure that they're not too over the top. But as you can see, the that sort of green tint really helps you merge the highlight in together and really creates a really smooth blend. One final touch of ice yellow on the very extremity, and I think we should be perfect with the scythe. Looks nice and dangerous, looks like something that would go on reaping souls willy-nilly, as you would imagine the undead to do on the battlefield. A little bit more snakebite leather, again to darken the areas towards the hand. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the idea that you don't always need to apply highlights. If the whole goal of painting a model is to push contrasts dark to light to help you pick out these things visually, separate them to the eye, then separate the different parts of the eye, then what you can do is, instead of applying highlights all the time, which are time consuming and sometimes a little bit challenging, especially if the area is hard to reach, you can simply just apply a little bit more shading wash to try to separate those areas visually. Now, I am going to grab a little bit of red because I kind of want to do his eyes in red. I like the idea of him having like scary little bloodshot peepers. So for his eyes, I've got a bit of my usual red mix, which is Blood Angels red mixed with a little bit of, well, not a little bit, but 50-50 with Gryphcharger. 50-50 is decidedly not a little bit. It is an equal part, literally. And try to maybe not overflow so much. But that's okay. We can come back in with a little bit of white to touch it up. Not a huge deal. Yeah, some touch-ups definitely required over there. The next thing I want to do is I want to come back to the purple because having looked at how far we've taken the scythe, In terms of a highlight, I think it might be necessary to push the purple a little bit more. This time I'll be mixing in a little bit of Vallejo white because it's nice and thick in order to get some really sharp defined highlights. Okay, that's maybe a bit too much, but it's okay. That's certainly very punchy. Purple is an interesting color, isn't it? There's something about the level of saturation that you get out of most purples that sometimes makes it difficult to use as the main color on a miniature simply because it's not that strong of a color. It tends to recede a little bit. And when you highlight it a lot, you end up with a pink instead of a purple, instead of a pale purple. Or if you do, find yourself able to generate a nice lavender, a light purple shade like lavender, the problem then is that it looks fairly weak and washed out. So sometimes it's a little bit challenging to try to find that balance to get your purples looking nice and rich and strong. But in my experience, what I found is that I try to keep it sort of like black insofar as I don't highlight very large amounts of real estate on the surface. I just try to keep the highlights relatively small and tight so that they don't look too washed out by covering too much surface area. So keep the highlights relatively small and reserved, and the purple kind of, well, you have a lot more purple in the miniature, whereas were we to spend a lot of real estate on highlights, then we might end up with something that looks very washed out and very desaturated, which is not ideal. Especially when purple is supposed to be the main color. Hold the model at eyes length and you at arm's length. Sorry, not eyes length. Eyes not that long. But yeah, hold the models at arm's length, and you might find that it might be hard to see the purple actually. So we need to be fairly careful with how we proportion the amount of real estate given to each highlight, such that the purple doesn't vanish entirely from the surface. I hope you catch my drift. But yeah, a few choice spots with nice bright purple, and I think we should be in a good place. Also, dropping back in to trim down some of the highlights just ever so slightly, and I think we are okay. Right, let's fix those eyes. So I kind of went a bit insane with the eyes, didn't I? Yeah. Okay, so let's trim back. We're not really aiming for an OSL kind of style to the eyes. Just wanted to do the eyes in red. So let's trim that back. And make sure we get both forehead, or rather eyebrow ridges. Eye socket ridges, I suppose. A little bit more red now to touch up his actual eye again. And then just to finish this off, for my next trick, I will be taking a little bit of ice yellow and dotting it right in the middle. Is that dry? Yeah, it's not quite dry. So let's put a little bit of that on his cape, or his hood rather, his cowl. It's a rudimentary highlight. If anything, this really shows you how useful ice yellow can be, because not only does it serve as the apex highlight for yellow, it serves as the apex highlight for red as well. Or rather, that's what I like to use it for. Your mileage may vary. Experiment and figure out colors that you enjoy using, and I promise that painting miniatures will get more fun as a result. This eye is resisting me, however, right now. Come on. Sort of. Not quite. Needs a bit of a touch up, please. Yeah. we are somewhat there. Okay, so we're going to go back to Gryphcharger Grey and a little bit of Skeleton Horde to create the color that I like to call Ancient Bone. Our Ancient Bone mix, which is essentially the color that we use to do the all the bone areas on the surface of the miniature. Wherever there is, I guess, exposed bone on this poor husk of a creature. And yeah, so we're going to apply this very, very carefully to these skull sections. Very, very carefully indeed. Because they are the shallowest possible, like skull features on these cowl bits. If you apply the contrast paint sparingly, they can get picked up. Like so. The tiny little eye sockets. And tiny little nose holes. Might need highlights again to bring that up. But yeah. I think it looks alright. Once again, the painter's dance means we go back in with more white just to make sure that we get correct amounts of white as well as off-white for all of the bone bits, just to make sure that it looks balanced and in proportion in terms of lights and darks. So let's again do that nose. I guess it would have been better to do this the first time and get it perfect, but you know, such is the journey that painting takes us on sometimes. And if you ever find that sometimes the miniature isn't quite going quite the way you want it to, it's okay to take a breath. Just step away from it for a while, and come back when you're in a better mood to get these bits looking the best. Because at the end of the day, you're always going to have to live with the final version that you left it in, but it didn't say when exactly. I've decided I need a smaller brush for this area, so I'm going to grab a smaller brush and I'm going to try to reinstate the white on the teeth to make sure that it's nice and distinct and readable. Crazy small when you think about it. Cool. I think we are in a good spot. For the most part. Just a little bit of purple wash to kind of trim back some of the highlights again. In one or two places where I felt it needed to be a little bit more sharp and clear. And I think we are very nearly done. Oh yes, a little bit more white on the skulls on his cowl, because that deserves a little bit more definition. Oh, I hate when you get these little hairs on the tip of the brush. Okay, cool. So when it comes to highlighting these skulls, I think the most important area to actually highlight is the forehead section of the skull, which is towards the top. Like so. Just the area directly above the eye line. like so. And maybe this one over here. So, okay, so you can see there are three different separate skulls on this side, three different separate skulls on this side, and a cluster more on the top of the robe, like so. If you need more definition, and I think we do, a little bit more Iyanden yellow around the edges work. To bring a little bit more separation between these skulls, and to push the yellow more towards an orange. Which is not a terrible idea. I suppose yellow might not have been the best color to aim for. Perhaps a sort of gold yellow, saffron almost kind of color would have been more towards our goal of separating these parts visually. But there you go. Sometimes you just got to trial and error it so you're happy. There is a tiny little hole over there that I want to just fill in using a touch of Nuln Oil. And around the side of his head. And I think we are very close to being done with this guy. Just a little bit more work on his knuckles in white. Again, if you're not sure how much of a highlight to place on each part of the model, I recommend you hold the model at arm's length to see whether the highlights you placed are visible or not. Subtlety is all well and good, but remember these are tabletop miniatures. It does help to be able to see the hard work that you put in at a distance without making it too messy or raggedy, as the case may be. And I think that's it. I am happy with that. Okay, guys, I hope you've enjoyed watching me paint this. It's been a lot of fun to do. Oh, no. I've just had a moment. Sorry. I am going to add a bit of white to the ice yellow. Ooh. Sorry, guys. I sometimes do this. I see a bit that I immediately want to change as soon as I hold it a little bit further back to take in the whole miniature. Okay, cool. Something like that. A little bit of white, because I think as much as I like the ice yellow, having a definite apex point is important as well. Right. I think I'm done this time. So thanks for watching, guys, as I continue painting, of course. I hope you've enjoyed watching me paint this guy as much as I enjoyed painting him for you. And like, comment, and subscribe if you are so inclined. And if you enjoyed the video. If not, and in addition, I suppose, I will see you in the next one. Cheers, guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye. So just some close-ups. There we go.